Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where we dive deep into the mysteries that keep us awake at night. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to give a special thanks to DXD232 for this incredible video suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. Your suggestions fuel these late-night journeys into the unknown. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories. It really helps us continue bringing you these haunting tales. Now, settle in as we explore what happens when family secrets and government conspiracies collide in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the truth. The rain drummed against the chapel windows like fingers tapping out Morse code. Urgent, persistent, demanding attention. I sat in the front pew, staring at the flag-draped casket that held my grandfather, Colonel James Mitchell, United States Air Force, retired. The chaplain's words washed over me like white noise, meaningless platitudes about service and sacrifice that felt hollow in the echoing space. Grandpa Jim had always been a quiet man, the kind who could fill a room with his presence while saying nothing at all. His steel-grey eyes held secrets that I'd never been curious enough to ask about, and now those secrets were buried with him. Or so I thought. The military honour guard folded the flag with mechanical precision, each crease sharp enough to cut glass. When they handed it to me, the only family he had left, the weight of it seemed heavier than cloth and thread should be. 21 rifle shots cracked through the cemetery air, and I watched them lower my grandfather into the ground, taking with him 40 years of classified service that he'd never once discussed at family dinners. After the service, I stood alone by his grave as the other mourners drifted away like ghosts in the mist. Most were elderly veterans from his old squadron, men with weathered faces and knowing looks, who shook my hand with grips that still held strength despite their age. A few whispered condolences, but I noticed how they glanced at each other when they thought I wasn't looking. Shared glances that spoke of things unspoken. "He was a good man," said one particularly ancient veteran, his chest heavy with decades of ribbons and medals, kept his promises right to the end. There was something in the way he said it, an emphasis that made me wonder what promises he meant. The house felt different when I returned. Emptier, yes, but also somehow expectant, as if it were holding its breath. Grandpa Jim had lived here for 30 years, ever since Grandma passed, and every corner held memories of weekend visits and summer vacations. But now those memories felt incomplete, like photographs with faces cut out. I spent the next few days making arrangements, contacting lawyers, sorting through paperwork, deciding what to keep and what to donate. It was during this methodical dismantling of a life that I found myself standing in his bedroom, looking up at the attic access panel I'd never paid attention to before. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed up, flashlight in hand. The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Dusty boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, the detritus of a long life lived quietly. But as I moved deeper into the space, something caught my eye. In the far corner, beneath what looked like perfectly normal floorboards, there was a slight depression, as if the wood had been cut and replaced. My fingers found the edges easily once I knew what to look for. The section of flooring lifted away to reveal a hiding place that had been carefully constructed decades ago. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like a treasure map from some childhood adventure, was a briefcase. It was military issue, the kind of hard-sided case that could survive a nuclear blast. The locks were old but well maintained, and they opened with a satisfying click when I worked the combination. Grandma's birthday, because of course it was. Inside, the briefcase was divided into neat compartments, each holding documents that made my hands shake as I lifted them out. Top Secret Majestic-12 was stamped across every page in red ink that had faded to the colour of dried blood. The papers were yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, as if time had forgotten they existed. Most were typed on letterheads I didn't recognise, organisations with names like Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and Project Blue Book Special Studies Group. But it was the photograph that stopped my breathing entirely. 12 men in military uniforms and dark suits, standing in formation like they were posing for history. The setting looked official, some kind of government building with marble columns visible in the background. They all had the bearing of men accustomed to power, to making decisions that shaped the world from shadows. I recognised a few faces from history books: General Nathan Twining, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, officials whose names I'd heard in connection with early UFO investigations. But there in the back row, younger than the others and wearing an Air Force dress uniform, was my grandfather. The back of the photograph was annotated in careful handwriting: "The Committee, 1952. Below that, in different ink and what looked like a different hand, J. Mitchell, inducted 1962, Project Doorway." I spent the next 3 hours reading everything in that briefcase, and each document pulled me deeper into a reality I'd never imagined. There were incident reports from radar stations across the southwest, describing objects that moved in ways that defied physics. Photographs of wreckage that looked like nothing I'd ever seen. Metal that seemed to flow like liquid mercury, but held its shape like steel. Witness testimonies from pilots, air traffic controllers, and civilians who'd seen things in the sky that officially didn't exist. But the most unsettling document was a simple roster, typed on official letterhead from something called Majestic-12 Operations Command. 12 names were listed in alphabetical order, each followed by their service branch, rank, and what appeared to be a security clearance level that went beyond anything in the public domain. Most of the names I could research later: generals and admirals, a few scientists from Los Alamos and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, men who'd built America's military-industrial complex from the ground up. But one name, the 7th on the list, was completely blacked out with what looked like permanent marker. Even on a document that was clearly decades old, someone had taken the time to obscure that particular identity. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in my grandfather's distinctive script, was an addition: James R. Mitchell, Colonel, USAF, inducted March 15, 1962, clearance level, Umbra. The date meant something. 1962 was the year my father was born, the year my grandparents bought this house. It was when Grandpa Jim's career took a sudden upward trajectory that I'd never really questioned before. One day he was a squadron commander at a routine airbase. The next he was being reassigned to positions that sounded important, but which he never talked about. Liaison work, he'd always said when I asked. Coordinating between different departments. Now I understood that his vague answers hadn't been modesty. They'd been security protocols. The more I read, the more questions multiplied. There were references to recovered materials and non-terrestrial technology. Meeting minutes discussed containment procedures and public information management. One particularly chilling memo, dated 1963, discussed the termination protocols for individuals who posed security risks to the program. But what disturbed me most was how recent some of the documents were. The briefcase contained papers dating all the way up to 1995, 3 years before my grandfather's official retirement. Whatever Majestic-12 was, it hadn't ended with the Cold War. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned each document to its place. The briefcase went back into its hiding spot, and I replaced the floorboard exactly as I'd found it. But even as I tried to restore normalcy, I knew there was no going back. The questions were already consuming me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my grandfather's guest room, my room now, I supposed, and stared at the ceiling while rain continued its Morse code against the windows. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every sound might be footsteps from people who knew I'd found what I wasn't supposed to find. By morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. My friend Marcus worked as a contractor for the Department of Defense, something involving cybersecurity that he was deliberately vague about. We'd known each other since college, and I trusted him more than anyone else in my life. If anyone could help me understand what I'd found, it would be him. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those places that stayed busy enough to provide cover for conversation. I'd brought printouts of a few of the less sensitive documents, nothing that mentioned names or specific operations, just enough to give him context. Marcus studied the papers with the intensity of someone who knew what to look for. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he read, and when he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before: fear. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather's attic." "Marcus, is this real?" He glanced around the coffee shop, then leaned closer. "Do you have any idea what you're dealing with here? These classifications, I've never seen anything like them. Umbra clearance? That's not supposed to exist. But it does exist. That's the problem." He gathered the papers and handed them back to me. "Listen to me very carefully. Go home, burn these, and never mention them to anyone again." Marcus --. "I'm serious. There are things the government doesn't want people to know, and there are things the government will kill people to keep secret. This feels like the second kind." His words should have scared me away. Instead, they had the opposite effect. The journalist in me, the part that had driven me to a career in investigative reporting before I'd settled into the comfortable mediocrity of freelance writing, suddenly awakened after years of dormancy. "What if I don't want to let this go?" Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Then you're on your own." And whatever happens next, we never had this conversation. He left his coffee unfinished and walked out, leaving me alone with questions that felt heavier than they had before. But I'd expected this reaction. Anyone who worked within the system would be trained to avoid anything that could compromise their clearance or their career. I needed to find someone who operated outside those constraints. I spent the afternoon researching Majestic-12 online, falling down rabbit holes that led to conspiracy forums, declassified documents, and academic papers about government secrecy. Most of what I found was speculation and fantasy, but scattered through the noise were threads of genuine research by people who dedicated their lives to uncovering the truth. That evening, I made my second mistake of the week. I called my friend Sarah, a journalist with connections throughout the intelligence community, and asked if she'd ever heard of anything called Majestic-12. The line went silent for so long that I thought the caller dropped. "Where are you hearing that name?" she finally asked. "It's probably nothing. Family history stuff. Meet me tomorrow, not at my office, somewhere public, and don't mention this to anyone else until we talk." The urgency in her voice should have been another warning. Instead, it felt like validation. I wasn't chasing shadows. I was onto something real. But I never made it to that meeting. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass. The house was dark, but something was wrong with the darkness. It felt occupied, as if invisible presence was moving through it. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. The landline was dead too. From somewhere below came the sound of footsteps, careful and deliberate. They moved through the house with purpose, as if the intruders knew exactly where they were going. I heard them climbing the stairs to the second floor, then the creak of the attic ladder being lowered. I hid in the bathroom and waited. The sounds from above were methodical, things being moved, floorboards being pried up, the briefcase being opened. They knew exactly where to look. 20 minutes later, the footsteps receded. I heard a vehicle start in the driveway, then fade into the distance. When I finally found the courage to investigate, the attic had been searched thoroughly, but not destructively. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was stolen. They'd simply examined everything and left. But they'd left something behind. On my kitchen table, weighted down by my grandfather's coffee mug, was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in the same font as the documents I'd found. "Return what doesn't belong to you. No one will believe you anyway." The message was unsigned, but the implication was clear. They knew who I was, they knew what I'd found, and they were giving me a chance to walk away quietly. The old me, the careful, risk-averse me, might have taken that chance. But something had changed. Maybe it was reading those documents and realizing that my grandfather had spent decades keeping secrets that could reshape our understanding of reality. Maybe it was the casual way they'd invaded my home, as if my privacy and safety were irrelevant details. Or maybe it was the arrogance of that final line, "No one will believe you anyway." They were probably right, but I was going to try anyway. I found David Kellerman through a recommendation on a UFO research forum. He was a retired aerospace historian who'd spent 30 years studying the intersection of government secrecy and unexplained aerial phenomena. His academic credentials were impressive: MIT, CALTECH, positions with NASA. and the RAND Corporation, but he'd sacrificed his mainstream career to pursue questions that his former colleagues considered career suicide. His office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a Chinese restaurant, the kind of anonymous location that suggested someone who valued privacy over prestige. The interior looked like a library had exploded. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with books, journals and filing boxes that seemed to follow an organisational system only he understood. Kellerman himself was exactly what I'd expected. 60s, grey-beard, eyes that held the intensity of someone who'd spent years looking for patterns that others missed. He poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration and settled behind a desk covered with documents. "You mentioned Majestic-12 on the phone," he said without preamble. "That's not a term people use casually." I pulled out the photograph I'd found and placed it on his desk. Kellerman's reaction was immediate and startling. He actually recoiled as if I'd shown him something dangerous. "Where did you get this?" "My grandfather's attic. He died last week." Kellerman studied the photo with a magnifying glass, his expression growing more troubled with each face he examined. "This is... Jesus. Do you know who these people are?" "Some of them. General Twining, Admiral Hillenkoetter, the founding members of the most secret organisation in American history. These 12 men controlled information about unexplained aerial phenomena for decades. They decided what the public knew, what scientists could study, what pilots could report." He pointed to each face in turn, rattling off names and positions that painted a picture of a shadow organisation with connections throughout the military-industrial complex. But when he reached the man I'd identified as my grandfather, he paused. "I don't recognise this one. That's unusual. I thought I knew all the confirmed MJ-12 members. That's my grandfather, James Mitchell. The back says he was inducted in 1962. Kellerman flipped the photo over and read the notation. His face went pale. "Project Doorway. I've heard that name exactly once before, in a document that was leaked and then disappeared within hours. It was supposedly some kind of advanced research initiative, but nobody knows what they were researching. What do you think they found?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "You really don't know, do you? Your grandfather never told you anything. He never talked about his work. Ever." Kellerman leaned back in his chair, studying me as if trying to determine how much truth I could handle. "The conventional wisdom is that MJ-12 was formed in 1947 to investigate the Roswell incident. But the evidence suggests they were actually created to manage something much bigger, a systematic recovery and study program for non-human technology." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Non-human technology. Even hearing it said out loud felt surreal. "You're talking about UFOs. I'm talking about recovered materials, reverse-engineered technology, and a cover-up that's lasted 75 years. He gestured toward the photograph. These men weren't just investigating unexplained aircraft. They were trying to understand technology that was decades or centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. And my grandfather was part of this. If this photograph is authentic, then your grandfather was inducted into the most classified program in human history. Project Doorway might have been where they kept their most sensitive research, the things too dangerous or too revolutionary to share with the rest of MJ-12. Kellerman stood and moved to one of his filing cabinets, retrieving a folder thick with documents and photographs. "I need you to understand something. The people who ran this program didn't just classify information. They eliminated threats. Researchers who asked too many questions disappeared. Witnesses were discredited or worse. Talking about this publicly could put you on lists you don't want to be on. Someone already broke into my house. They know I have this." His expression darkened. "Then you're already on the list. The question is what you're going to do about it." I thought about my grandfather's life of careful silence, about all the questions I'd never asked, and all the answers I'd never received. Then I thought about that arrogant note left on my kitchen table, the casual assumption that I could be intimidated into compliance. "I want to know the truth. All of it." Kellerman nodded slowly as if he'd expected this answer. "Then we're going to need help. There are others, researchers, former military personnel. People who've been asking the same questions you're asking. But we'll need to be careful. The moment you start connecting dots publicly, they'll move to shut you down. How? However they need to. These people have resources you can't imagine and authorization you don't want to think about. But there might be a way to get ahead of them if you're willing to take the risk. Over the next 2 hours, Kellerman outlined a plan that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. Instead of trying to investigate MJ-12 from the outside, we would use the documents I'd found to force them into the open. By releasing carefully selected information through multiple channels simultaneously, we could create too many fires for them to contain at once. The key, he explained, is making sure the information spreads faster than they can respond. Once it's out there, they can't put it back in the bottle. It was a good plan. It might even have worked. But we never got the chance to find out. I spent the next morning at Kellerman's office, helping him scan and catalogue every document from my grandfather's briefcase. We worked methodically, creating multiple backup copies and preparing a release package that would be impossible to suppress completely. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Simultaneous uploads to WikiLeaks, multiple UFO research organisations, and several mainstream journalists who'd shown interest in government transparency issues. Kellerman had contacts throughout the UFO research community, people who'd spent years waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. Within hours, we had confirmation that major research organisations were prepared to receive and distribute the documents. Everything was in place. At 3 p.m, I uploaded the complete document package to an encrypted file-sharing service that Kellerman had used successfully for previous leaks. The upload took 47 minutes, hundreds of pages of classified documents that would finally expose the truth about decades of government deception. For exactly 12 hours, I felt like we were winning. I woke up the next morning to a house without power, internet or phone service. The silence was so complete that it took me several minutes to realise what was wrong. No humming refrigerator, no digital clocks, no background noise from electronic devices. It was as if someone had cut the house off from the modern world entirely. Outside my bedroom window, a black SUV sat at the curb with its engine running. As I watched, a second vehicle pulled up behind it. Men in dark suits got out and began setting up some kind of equipment. Dishes and antennas that suggested sophisticated surveillance technology. My phone had no signal, but its battery was mysteriously drained despite being plugged in overnight. The landline was completely dead. I was effectively isolated from the outside world, but I wasn't quite ready to panic yet. This could still be intimidation rather than preparation for something worse. That illusion lasted until I tried to check the file-sharing site using my neighbour's Wi-Fi. The documents were gone. In their place was a message that made my blood turn cold. You are now under protective surveillance for your own safety. Do not attempt to leave the area or contact outside parties until you have been debriefed. Protective surveillance. As if kidnapping became legal when the government did it. I tried every backup plan Kellerman and I had discussed. Multiple file-sharing sites, email accounts, social media platforms. Every avenue we'd prepared had been somehow compromised or blocked. It was as if an invisible hand had reached into the internet and selectively deleted only the information we'd tried to share. The technical sophistication required for that kind of operation was staggering. It wasn't enough to monitor internet traffic. They had to have real-time access to multiple private servers and the ability to alter or delete data across platforms simultaneously. The resources required suggested an operation far beyond normal law enforcement or even typical intelligence agencies. By noon, I was completely cut off. The men outside had set up a perimeter that looked professional, but not overtly threatening. More like a protective detail than an arrest team. But the message was clear. I wasn't leaving until someone decided I could leave. I spent the afternoon trying to understand what I was dealing with. Whoever these people were, they had capabilities that seemed to transcend normal government authority. They could shut down utilities, manipulate internet infrastructure, and coordinate surveillance operations without any visible oversight or legal process. But they'd also gone to elaborate lengths to avoid direct confrontation. The message had called it protective surveillance, and their behaviour suggested they wanted cooperation rather than conflict. That meant they needed something from me, information, compliance, or something else I couldn't yet identify. At 6 p.m, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole to see a woman in a dark business suit alone, holding what appeared to be an official government identification. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Most importantly, she didn't look like the kind of person who would kick down doors or make threats. "Mr. Mitchell," she said when I opened the door, "my name is Agent Elizabeth Morrison, and I represent a group that worked very closely with your grandfather. We need to talk." Agent Morrison's credentials identified her as working for something called Advanced Special Programs Division, which meant nothing to me but seemed genuine enough. She declined to come inside, suggesting instead that we take a drive to somewhere more secure for our conversation. "More secure for whom?" I asked. "For everyone involved. Your house is being monitored by multiple parties now, and not all of them have your best interests at heart." The statement was cryptic enough to be either a threat or a warning. Against my better judgment, I decided to trust her. Maybe it was her professional demeanour, or maybe I was simply tired of being trapped in my own home, but something about Agent Morrison seemed different from the faceless surveillance team that had been watching me. We drove in her unmarked sedan through the suburbs and then out into the desert, following highways that grew progressively emptier as we moved away from civilization. Morrison didn't speak during the drive, and I found myself studying her profile, trying to read intent in the set of her jaw and the way she gripped the steering wheel. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. "To see something your grandfather helped build." After 2 hours of driving, we turned off the main highway onto a dirt road that looked like it led nowhere. But after several miles of desert scrub and Joshua trees, a chain-link fence appeared in the distance, topped with razor wire and surrounded by warning signs about restricted military areas. The facility beyond the fence looked abandoned. Old buildings with broken windows, a few rusted antenna arrays, and what might once have been a radar installation. It looked like dozens of other Cold War-era installations scattered throughout the southwest, the kind of place that had been built quickly and abandoned just as quickly when budgets shifted or missions changed. But appearances were deceiving. Agent Morrison used a key card to open gates that looked rusty but operated smoothly, and I noticed that despite the apparent abandonment, the roads were well maintained and the power lines were clearly active. What is this place? Officially? A decommissioned early warning station that was closed in 1967. Unofficially, it's been continuously operational for 58 years. She parked in front of the largest building and led me to an entrance that was hidden from casual view. "Your grandfather spent a lot of time here in the 1960s and 70s. The interior was a revelation. Beyond the facade of abandonment was a facility that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Clean corridors with modern lighting, security checkpoints with advanced scanning equipment, and an elevator that descended far deeper than should have been possible in a desert installation." "Welcome to Site 7, Morrison said as the elevator continued its descent. "One of 12 facilities where we study materials that don't officially exist." The elevator opened onto a vast underground complex that stretched in multiple directions. The architecture was utilitarian but clearly expensive. Reinforced concrete, climate control systems and security measures that suggested whatever was stored here was extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. Morrison led me through corridors lined with laboratories and storage areas, past rooms filled with equipment I couldn't identify, and technicians who barely looked up from their work. The scale of the operation was staggering. This wasn't a small research facility. It was an entire underground city dedicated to purposes I couldn't yet comprehend. "How long has this been here?" "Construction began in 1953, expanded continuously ever since. Your grandfather was one of the original planners. We stopped at a massive vault door that required multiple security protocols to open. Morrison used her keycard, submitted to a retinal scan, and entered a code that was at least 12 digits long. When the door finally opened, I found myself staring into a storage facility that looked like a combination warehouse and museum. The space was filled with display cases, each containing objects that challenged my understanding of physics and engineering. Metal fragments that seemed to shift colour as I watched them. Circuits printed on substrates that looked organic rather than synthetic. Components that hummed with energy despite having no visible power source. "Recovered materials," Morrison explained simply. "Things we've found at crash sites over the past 70 years. I approached the nearest display case and found myself looking at what appeared to be a piece of hull material from some kind of aircraft, but the metal, if it was metal, seemed to flow like liquid while maintaining a solid form. As I watched, patterns appeared and disappeared on its surface, as if it were responding to my presence. What am I looking at? Technology that's decades ahead of anything humans have developed. Materials that don't follow our understanding of physics. Engineering principles we still can't fully comprehend. Case after case contained similar impossible objects. Fragments of machinery that operated on principles beyond current science. Alloys that shouldn't exist. Components that seemed to generate power from nothing. It was a museum of impossibility. Proof that someone or something had solved technological challenges that humanity was still struggling to understand. But it was the far wall that stopped my breathing entirely. A grid of black and white photographs covered the entire surface. Dozens of images showing crash sites from around the world. Some I recognised from UFO research. Roswell, of course. But also incidents I'd read about in declassified Air Force documents. Others were completely unfamiliar, showing recovery operations in locations ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical forests. Each photograph was labelled with a date, location, and classification number. The dates ranged from 1947 to just last year, suggesting that whatever was crashing wasn't a historical curiosity but an ongoing phenomenon. 75 years, Morrison said quietly. 75 years of recovered materials, and we're still trying to understand how they work. Who built them? That's the question your grandfather spent his career trying to answer. I was studying a particularly clear photograph of what looked like a disc-shaped craft being loaded onto a military trailer when I heard footsteps behind us. Multiple sets of boots on concrete, moving with military precision. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for the tour, Morrison said, her tone suddenly formal and apologetic. I turned to see 6 soldiers in combat gear entering the vault, weapons lowered but ready. Unlike the surveillance team at my house, these men wore full military uniforms with unit patches I didn't recognise. Hands where we can see them, their leader commanded, though his tone was professional rather than threatening. I raised my hands slowly, trying to process what was happening. Agent Morrison? But Morrison was backing away, her expression genuinely regretful. I'm sorry. I was hoping we could resolve this differently, but the decision has been made at levels above my authority. The soldiers surrounded me without violence, clearly following protocols for handling a cooperative subject. But as they guided me toward the exit, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. On the wall of photographs in the bottom right corner was an image I hadn't noticed before. It showed a crash site that looked recent, emergency vehicles, military personnel, and in the background a house that looked suspiciously familiar. My grandfather's house. My house. The photograph was dated 3 days ago, the day after I'd found the briefcase in the attic. They didn't arrest me, but they didn't let me go either. Instead, I found myself in what could generously be called a conference room, but which felt more like an interrogation chamber. Windowless walls, a metal table, and chairs that were designed for function rather than comfort. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to understand how my search for truth had led to detention in an underground government facility. When the door finally opened, the man who entered looked exactly like what Hollywood would cast as a government spook. Mid-50s, greying hair, expensive suit that managed to look both formal and threatening. He carried a manila folder and moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected other people's lives. Mr. Mitchell, he said, settling into the chair across from me. My name is Director William Hayes. I represent the organisation your grandfather served for over 30 years. He opened the folder and withdrew a photograph, the same one I'd found in my grandfather's briefcase, showing 12 men in military uniforms and suits. But this copy was different. Instead of my grandfather's handwritten notation on the back, this version had an official stamp and classification marking. Majestic-12, Hayes continued, was never what people thought it was. It wasn't 12 men making decisions about UFO policy. It was 12 seats, positions that have been continuously filled by individuals with specific skills and clearances, and my grandfather held one of those seats. The 12th seat, specifically, Your grandfather was recruited in 1962 because of his expertise in aerospace engineering and his security clearance, but also because of his psychological profile. We needed someone who could compartmentalize information and work on projects that challenge conventional understanding of reality. Hayes withdrew another document from the folder, a psychological evaluation with my grandfather's name and photograph. The assessment was thorough and unsettling, analysing everything from his cognitive abilities to his likelihood of developing moral objections to classified work. Project Doorway was your grandfather's primary assignment, Hayes explained. While the rest of MJ-12 focused on recovery and analysis of materials, Doorway was tasked with practical application, taking recovered technology and developing human applications. You're talking about reverse engineering? I'm talking about the most advanced research program in human history. Integrated circuits, fibre optics, advanced metallurgy, dozens of technologies that revolutionised human civilization were actually derived from materials we recovered starting in 1947. The implications were staggering. If Hayes was telling the truth, then much of modern technology wasn't the result of human innovation, but rather reverse-engineered alien science. Our computers, our communications, our material science, all of it built on a foundation of borrowed knowledge. Why are you telling me this? Because Majestic-12 never disbanded. It evolved. Hayes leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. Government programs have limitations, oversight, budgets, political interference. But private organisations can operate with greater flexibility and fewer restrictions. You went private. We became self-sustaining. The technologies we developed generated revenue streams that funded continued research. By 1995, we were completely independent of government oversight or funding. It made a certain perverse sense. If you could reverse engineer advanced technology, you could patent and license innovations that would generate enormous profits. Those profits could fund more research, more recovery operations, more technological advancement. A self-perpetuating cycle of discovery and development that operated outside normal economic and political constraints. The question, Hayes continued, is what happens now? Your investigation has attracted attention from multiple parties, some friendly, others less so. You have a choice to make. He placed 2 items on the table between us. The first was a standard non-disclosure agreement, the kind of legal document that would bind me to silence about everything I'd seen and learned. The second was a keycard similar to the one Agent Morrison had used to access the facility. Option 1, you sign the NDA, agree never to discuss or investigate this matter further, and return to your normal life. We'll ensure your safety and provide compensation for any inconvenience you've experienced. And option 2, you take the keycard and accept an invitation to join the organisation your grandfather served. The 12th seat has been vacant since his death 3 days ago. The offer was so unexpected that I couldn't immediately process it. You want me to become part of the cover-up? I want you to become part of the solution. Hayes' expression didn't change, but his tone became more urgent. Do you think we've spent 75 years hiding this technology for fun? Do you think we enjoy keeping scientific breakthroughs locked away in underground vaults? Then why do it? Because releasing it too quickly would destabilize human civilization. Imagine if we'd introduced integrated circuit technology in 1950, or revealed anti-gravity principles in 1960. The economic, political and social disruption would have been catastrophic. Hayes stood and moved to a wall-mounted display that I hadn't noticed before. With the touch of a button, it came alive with charts and graphs showing technological advancement over the past century. We've been carefully introducing recovered technology into human civilization for decades, he explained. Each innovation is timed to coincide with humanity's ability to understand and integrate it safely. We're not suppressing progress, we're managing it. The display showed a timeline that was both fascinating and disturbing. Major technological breakthroughs that I'd assumed were human achievements were actually marked as controlled releases of recovered technology. The transistor, laser technology, stealth aircraft design, all of it apparently derived from non-human sources, but introduced gradually to avoid societal shock. Your grandfather understood this, Hayes continued. He spent 30 years helping us determine what humanity was ready to know and when they were ready to know it. The 12th seat has always been responsible for this delicate balance. And if I refuse both options? Hayes returned to his chair, and for the first time his professional composure slipped slightly. Then you become a security risk that needs to be managed. We prefer cooperation, but we will protect this program by any means necessary. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. I could join them, be silenced by legal agreement, or be silenced by other means. But there was something else in his expression, a hope that I would choose cooperation over coercion. I need time to think. Time is a luxury we don't have. Your investigation has already attracted attention from foreign intelligence services and radical transparency groups. Every hour you remain uncommitted increases the risk of exposure. Hayes withdrew one final document from his folder, an intelligence briefing that showed my photograph alongside analysis of my online activities, social connections and potential security risks. They'd been watching me far longer than I'd realised, probably since the moment I'd mentioned Majestic-12 to Marcus. If you accept the position, you'll have access to technologies that could revolutionise human understanding of physics, energy and space travel. You'll be part of the most important scientific endeavour in history, and if I try to expose what I've learned, then you'll join a long list of people who tried to reveal secrets they didn't understand. Some were discredited, others simply disappeared. A few suffered more creative fates. The casual way he mentioned murder made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to consider the offer objectively. If everything Hayes had told me was true, if there really was recovered non-human technology being slowly integrated into human civilization, then perhaps controlled disclosure was better than chaos. But there was something about the entire setup that felt wrong. The underground facility, the private organisation operating without oversight, the casual threats against anyone who might expose the truth. Even if their intentions were good, the methods felt like something from a totalitarian nightmare. What happened to the other 11 seats? They're still filled. The organisation has evolved, but the structure remains the same. 12 individuals with different specialties, working together to manage humanity's relationship with non-terrestrial intelligence. Non-terrestrial intelligence? You're admitting these materials came from aliens. Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the room, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Mr. Mitchell, that's the least shocking thing you'll learn if you accept this position. I made my decision at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, sitting in my grandfather's kitchen and staring at the key card Director Hayes had given me. They'd returned me to my house with a 12-hour deadline, promising that my choice would be final and irreversible. The surveillance team was still outside, but their presence had shifted from threatening to protective. Agent Morrison had stopped by earlier to explain that foreign intelligence services were now actively searching for me, having detected the brief leak of classified documents. Whether I joined the organisation or simply signed an NDA, I would need their protection. I'd spent hours reading everything I could find about my grandfather's military service, looking for clues about the man who'd kept such enormous secrets for so many years. His commendations were impressive but vague, full of references to special projects and classified contributions to national security. Between the lines, I could see the outline of a man who'd struggled with the weight of knowledge he couldn't share. There was a journal I'd found in his desk, mostly mundane entries about daily life and family events, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that made more sense now that I understood his real work. Made progress on the translation project today, he'd written in 1968. The mathematics are unlike anything we've seen before. Translation project, as if he'd been trying to understand instructions written in a non-human language. The most revealing entry was from 1985. 23 years of this work, and I still don't know if we're preparing humanity for the future, or betraying it to forces we don't understand, but the alternative, chaos, panic, the collapse of everything we've built, seems worse than continuing down this path. Grandfather had wrestled with the same choice I was facing now. Join a conspiracy that might be protecting humanity, or risk exposing truths that could destroy the foundations of human civilization. At 4 a.m, I made my choice. I walked to my front door and opened it slowly. Agent Morrison was waiting on the porch, as if she'd known this moment would come. "Have you decided?" she asked. I looked at the key card in my hand, then at the surveillance vehicles that had become as familiar as the landscape. Beyond them, the desert stretched toward mountains that looked like sleeping giants in the pre-dawn darkness. "My grandfather kept these secrets for 30 years, I said finally. "How did he live with it?" He understood that some truths are too dangerous for democracy to handle, but that doesn't mean they should be hidden forever, just managed carefully until humanity is ready. "And you think I'm ready to make those decisions?" Morrison's expression was genuinely sympathetic. "I think you're the only one who can. Your grandfather chose you for this role long before you found that briefcase. Why do you think he kept it where you would find it after his death?" The implication hit me like cold water. The briefcase hadn't been hidden from me. It had been preserved for me. My grandfather had spent his final years preparing for this moment, when his secrets would become my responsibility. "The 12th seat," I said quietly. "Welcome to Majestic-12, Mr. Mitchell." I handed her the key card, then walked back into the house that now felt like someone else's life. In 12 hours, I would report to Site 7 for orientation and briefing. I would learn about technologies that shouldn't exist, about contact with intelligences that weren't human, about decisions that shaped the future of human civilization. But first, I had one final task to complete. I sat at my grandfather's desk and opened a new document on my laptop. If I was going to join the conspiracy, I was going to document everything I could remember about the journey that brought me here. Not for publication, I understood now that some secrets had to be kept, but for the person who would someday find themselves in my position. Because there would always be a 12th seat, and it would always need to be filled by someone willing to bear the weight of impossible knowledge. I began typing, "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you to find." The briefcase was just the beginning. What follows is the real story, the one they don't tell you until after you've already agreed to carry it forward. Outside, the sun was rising over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. It looked like the dawn of a new world, which I supposed it was, at least for me. 3 months later, I was sitting in a conference room beneath Site 7, surrounded by 11 other people who'd made the same choice I had made. We were reviewing intelligence reports about a crash in northern Canada, discussing recovery protocols and containment procedures with the casual professionalism of people who'd spent years managing the impossible. The work was exactly as advertised. Fascinating, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. Every day brought new evidence that humanity was not alone in the universe, and every day brought new decisions about how much of that truth the world was ready to handle. I thought about my grandfather often, wondering if he'd felt the same mix of pride and guilt that consumed me now. We were guardians of humanity's future, protectors of civilization stability, and keepers of secrets that could transform or destroy everything humans had built. But late at night, when I returned to the house that now felt more like a museum than a home, I sometimes wondered about the road not taken. What if I had chosen transparency over secrecy? What if I had tried to tell the world about recovered technology and non-human intelligence? Would humanity have been ready for that truth? Or would it have torn apart the fabric of civilization, just as Director Hayes had warned? I supposed I would never know. But every morning I woke up and chose to believe that gradual disclosure was better than sudden chaos, that managed truth was better than devastating revelation. After all, that's what the 12th seat was for, to make the hard choices so others didn't have to. And if someday I was wrong, if the secrecy caused more harm than transparency would have, well, hopefully the person who inherited my position would be wiser than I had been. The briefcase was waiting in the attic, exactly where my grandfather had left it, exactly where I would leave it when my time came. Along with a letter that began, "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you to find." Some traditions, it seemed, were worth preserving, even the secret ones. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, I want to give a thank you to Nomasifos Camas for suggesting this story concept. Your ideas help make sleep theories what it is today. If you have your own story suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more spine-tingling content that will keep you up at night. What lies beyond the forbidden line in Antarctica? Some boundaries exist for reasons we're never meant to understand. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I saw beneath the ice, and why they'll never let me tell anyone about it. I used to be somebody in the mountaineering world, spent 15 years conquering peaks that most people only see in documentaries, the Andes, the Himalayas, places where the air gets so thin you can taste death with every breath. I had sponsors, magazine covers, speaking engagements. Then came the incident on Everest. 3 climbers died because of a decision I made, and suddenly my name became poison in the climbing community. That's how I ended up in a dingy office in Christchurch, New Zealand, staring at a contract from Meridian Logistics. They needed an experienced mountaineer to guide a survey team in Antarctica. Weather station installations, they said. Scientific equipment placement. Nothing dangerous, nothing complicated. Just use my expertise to keep their people alive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The money was good. Too good for what they claimed was simple work, but I was broke, blacklisted, and running out of options. I signed the papers without reading the fine print. I should have read the fine print. 3 days later, I was on a cargo plane headed for the bottom of the world, watching the last traces of civilization disappear beneath a blanket of endless white. The other passengers were quiet, professional types who avoided eye contact and spoke in whispers. Government contractors, maybe, or worse. We landed at McMurdo Base as the Antarctic summer was beginning to fade. Even in the relatively warm season, the cold hit me like a physical blow when the cargo doors opened. But it wasn't just the temperature that made me shiver, it was the silence. Antarctica doesn't just lack sound, it devours it. Every word, every footstep, every breath gets swallowed by the infinite white void. Commander Hayes met me at the landing strip. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of permanent squint that comes from decades of staring at snow. His handshake was firm but brief, as if he didn't want to waste time on pleasantries. "You're our mountain expert," he said, leading me toward a cluster of prefab buildings. "Your job is simple. Keep the science team alive while they do their work. We go out in 2 days." "What kind of scientific work?" I asked. Hayes paused mid-step. "Weather stations. Climate monitoring. Standard stuff." It wasn't the answer that bothered me. It was the way he delivered it, like he was reciting lines from a script. But I kept my mouth shut. I was being paid to guide, not to ask questions. That evening I sat in the mess hall picking at a plate of reconstituted beef stew and listening to the conversations around me. Most of it was typical base chatter, complaints about the food, speculation about weather patterns, gossip about personnel rotations. But then I caught something that made my blood run cold. 2 officers sat at a table near the wall, speaking in low voices. I couldn't make out most of their conversation, but one phrase came through crystal clear. Another team didn't come back, not a single trace. I turned to look at them, but they were already standing, clearing their trays. As they walked past my table, one of them glanced at me with an expression I couldn't read. Warning? Pity? Fear? Later that night, lying in my narrow bunk, I stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself I'd misheard. Teams went missing in Antarctica all the time. Equipment failures, weather emergencies, simple human error in an environment that forgave nothing. Didn't have to mean anything sinister. But sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, I dreamed of endless white horizons and voices calling from beneath the ice. The next morning, Hayes briefed the team in a conference room that smelled like coffee and diesel fuel. There were 6 of us total. Hayes as team leader, myself as mountain guide, 2 scientists named Martinez and Volkov, a communications specialist called Jackson, and a supply coordinator named Thompson. Hayes spread a map across the table, marking our route with a red pen. "We'll be travelling roughly 200 kilometres southeast of here," he said. "The terrain is mostly flat ice sheets, but there are some crevasse fields we'll need to navigate carefully." He drew a thick black line across the map. This is longitude 164 degrees east. Under no circumstances does anyone cross this line. For safety and treaty compliance, this is absolutely forbidden territory. What's past the line? Martinez asked. She was a young woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of pale complexion that suggested she spent most of her time in laboratories. Nothing that concerns us, Hayes replied curtly. Our job is to establish monitoring stations along this route. He tapped several points on the map. 3 locations, 2 days at each site. Simple installation work. But as I studied the map, something nagged at me. The forbidden line didn't follow any natural geographical feature. No mountain ridge, no obvious hazard zone. It was perfectly straight, as if drawn by bureaucrats in an office thousands of miles away. And beyond it, the map showed nothing but blank white space. Questions? Hayes asked, already beginning to fold the map. I almost spoke up, almost asked about the missing team I'd overheard mentioned, but something in Hayes' expression warned me off. This wasn't a man who welcomed curiosity. No questions, I said. The others shook their heads as well. Good! We leave at 0600 tomorrow, get some sleep. But sleep was the last thing on my mind as I walked back to my quarters. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being sent out there for reasons that had nothing to do with weather stations, and that some of us weren't expected to come back. The convoy that left McMurdo Base the next morning looked more military than scientific. 3 tracked vehicles loaded with enough supplies for 2 weeks, plus emergency rations that could stretch to a month if needed. Hayes drove the lead vehicle, with Martinez and Volkov handling the scientific equipment. Thompson and Jackson took the supply vehicle in the middle, while I brought up the rear in the 3rd transport, alone with my thoughts and a growing sense of unease. The first day passed uneventfully. We travelled across relatively flat terrain, the vehicle's engines growling against the constant headwind. The landscape was monotonously beautiful, an endless expanse of white broken only by the occasional nunatak poking up through the ice, like a stone island in a frozen sea. By the 2nd day, however, I began to notice something odd. I'd spent enough time at extreme latitudes to develop an intuitive sense of solar position. In Antarctica during late summer, the sun should follow a predictable arc across the sky, never getting very high, but maintaining a steady pattern. But as I drove, squinting through the tinted visor of my goggles, the sun seemed wrong. Too high, too bright for what my internal compass told me was the correct time and date. I tried to dismiss it as disorientation from the long journey and the strange sleep patterns that came with Antarctic life. But when we stopped for our midday break, I casually asked Martinez if she'd noticed anything unusual about the light. She looked up from her instruments, frowning. Actually, yes. The angle seems off for our latitude and the time of year. I was wondering if there might be some kind of atmospheric refraction effect. Could be, I said, but her confirmation made my stomach tighten. The 3rd day brought a new concern. I'd been checking my compass regularly out of habit, using the magnetic bearing to verify our GPS heading. But as the day progressed, the needle began to drift. Slowly at first, then more dramatically. By afternoon, it was pointing almost 30 degrees off from where magnetic north should be. GPS could malfunction. Electronic equipment could fail in extreme cold. But a mechanical compass was about as reliable as navigation got, unless something was interfering with the Earth's magnetic field itself. "Hayes," I called over the radio. "Are you seeing any compass anomalies?" A long pause. "Negative. Why?" "My magnetic heading is way off GPS. Could be equipment failure." Another pause, longer this time. "Stay on GPS bearing. We'll check equipment at tonight's camp." But I noticed he didn't ask to see my compass readings, and when we stopped for the evening, he made no mention of checking anyone's equipment. The 4th day brought the most unsettling change yet. The terrain began to shift from the relatively flat ice fields we'd been crossing to something much more dramatic. Where the maps showed continued flat terrain, we encountered towering ice formations, not the chaotic jumble of pressure ridges I was used to seeing, but organised structures that looked almost artificial. Walls of ice rose 30, 40, even 50 feet high, running in perfectly straight lines across our path. We were forced to detour repeatedly, following what seemed like corridors between these frozen ramparts. The walls were smooth, almost glassy, as if they'd been carved rather than formed by natural processes. Pressure ridges, Martinez suggested during one of our stops, but she didn't sound convinced. I've never seen pressure ridges this regular, I replied. It's like someone built fortifications out of ice. Volkov, the older of the two scientists, had been quiet for most of the journey, but now he spoke up, his Russian accent thick with concern. In Siberia, we have stories of such things. Ice that builds itself into walls and towers, but they are just stories. What kind of stories? I asked. But before Volkov could answer, Hayes' voice crackled over the radio. Mount up. We're burning daylight. As we drove deeper into this maze of ice walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, guided along a specific path by someone or something that wanted us to go in a particular direction. The walls created a definite corridor leading southeast, toward the forbidden line that Hayes had marked on his map. By evening we were completely enclosed by the ice formations. They towered above us on all sides, creating a narrow valley that blocked out most of the sky. The walls glowed with an eerie blue light in the perpetual twilight, and our voices echoed strangely in the enclosed space. This isn't on any map, I told Hayes as we set up camp. Antarctic topography changes, he replied, not meeting my eyes. Ice shifts, new formations appear all the time. But I'd studied enough glaciology to know that wasn't how ice worked. These walls were old, carved by processes I couldn't begin to understand, and they were leading us somewhere specific. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind howl through the ice corridor, I heard something else beneath the sound of the storm. A low, rhythmic booming like distant thunder or a massive heartbeat. It seemed to come from deep beneath the ice, pulsing up through the frozen ground. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound faded away. When I checked my watch, it was just past midnight, though in Antarctica's endless twilight, time became almost meaningless. I was beginning to suspect that we weren't just approaching the forbidden line. We were being drawn toward it by forces that had nothing to do with weather stations or scientific research. And somewhere in the ice walls around us, I had the growing certainty that we were being watched. The booming sound returned just before dawn. I was awake instantly, every mountaineering instinct screaming danger. The sound was deeper than thunder, more sustained than an avalanche. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ice walls that surrounded our camp. The others felt it too. I could see lights moving in the other tents as people fumbled for flashlights and gear. Hayes was the first to emerge, his rifle slung across his shoulder, which was interesting, since he'd never mentioned weapons during our briefing. "Equipment check," he barked. "Everyone up. Now." We broke camp in record time, loading the vehicles while the echo of that mysterious boom still seemed to hang in the air. But as we prepared to continue southeast, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ice walls had changed during the night. The corridor that had led us here was now partially blocked by a fresh formation of ice, as if the walls had grown while we slept. But more disturbing was what lay ahead. The passage continued, but it was wider now, as if something had carved out more space for us to travel. "Natural ice movement," Hayes said when I pointed it out, but his hand never left his rifle. We drove in tense silence for the first few hours. The ice walls gradually receded, opening into a broader valley between towering formations, but the landscape ahead remained wrong. Hills where the maps showed flat ground, valleys that shouldn't exist, and always that sense of being guided along a predetermined path. It was Martinez who first spotted the crack. "Stop," she called over the radio, "there's something ahead." We pulled up about 50 metres from what looked like a shadow across the ice, but as we approached on foot, I realised it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a fissure in the ice sheet, running perpendicular to our path. The crack was maybe 3 feet wide, but I couldn't see the bottom even when I shone my flashlight into the depths. "Fresh break," I observed, examining the edges. The ice was clean and sharp, not weathered by wind and time. "This opened recently." "How recently?" Hayes asked. I knelt down and touched the edge of the crack. There were stress patterns in the ice that told a story. Sudden, violent separation caused by enormous forces from below. Hours, maybe. Could have been what caused that booming sound. But as I played my light along the fissure, I noticed something that made me pause. There was air movement coming up from the depths. Not the dead, still air you'd expect from a simple crack in the ice sheet, but a warm breeze that carried scents I couldn't identify. "There's airflow," I reported, "and it's warm." Volkov knelt beside me and held his hand over the crack. His eyes widened. This is not possible. Below ice sheets should be more ice, or rock, nothing that creates warm air. Hayes ordered us back to the vehicles, but I lingered at the edge of the fissure. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness below, I could make out shapes in the depths. Not just ice and rock, but something else. Dark surfaces that reflected my flashlight beam, and far below, so distant I might have been imagining it, a faint greenish glow. "Move out," Hayes called. But as we loaded back into the vehicles, I kept thinking about that warm breeze and the impossible glow from the depths. In 15 years of extreme environment experience, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts were telling me that we'd found something that wasn't supposed to exist. We spent the day detouring around the fissure, following its edge as it curved away to the southeast. The crack ran for kilometres without seeming to narrow or close. Occasionally I caught glimpses of that strange glow from the depths, always too distant and faint to be certain of what I was seeing. By evening we'd travelled nearly 20 kilometres along the fissure's edge without finding a way across. Hayes called a halt as the perpetual twilight deepened, and we made camp on a flat section of ice about 100 metres from the crack. "Tomorrow we find a way round," Hayes announced during our brief evening meal. "Mission parameters haven't changed." But I could see the tension in everyone's faces. Whatever we'd stumbled onto, it wasn't part of any weather station installation plan. As the others settled into their tents, I found myself drawn back to the edge of the fissure. The warm air was still flowing up from the depths, and now I could smell it more clearly. Not the sterile cold of Antarctic air, but something organic, almost alive, like moss and earth and growing things, impossible as that seemed. I was about to return to my tent when I heard voices, not from our camp, from below. I dropped to my belly and crawled to the very edge of the crack, listening intently. At first I thought it might be echoes from our own group, sound bouncing strangely off the ice walls. But the voices were too distant, too muffled, and they had a cadence that didn't match any language I recognised. As I strained to listen, a gust of warm air brought up something else, the scent of wood smoke and cooking food. Somewhere down in that impossible darkness, people were living their lives around fires and meals, as if the frozen wasteland above didn't exist. I was so focused on listening that I almost missed the light moving along the opposite edge of the fissure. It was just a flicker at first, barely visible in the twilight, but as I watched, it resolved into what looked like a torch or lantern, moving steadily along the far side of the crack. I couldn't make out who or what was carrying it, but the light moved with purpose, as if someone was patrolling the edges of their hidden world. The light paused directly across from where I lay. For a long moment it remained motionless, and I had the unsettling feeling that whoever held it was looking directly at me. Then it began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I crawled back from the edge and returned to my tent, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes I saw that distant light, and wondered what kind of people could survive in the depths beneath Antarctica's ice sheet. And more importantly, what they might do if they discovered we were up here, listening to their voices and watching their movements in the dark. I woke to the sound of arguing. Hayes and Jackson were standing near the vehicles, their voices low but heated. I couldn't make out the words, but their body language spoke volumes. Jackson was gesturing emphatically toward the fissure, while Hayes kept shaking his head and pointing southeast, in the direction of our original route. By the time I emerged from my tent, the argument had ended, but the tension remained. Jackson avoided eye contact during our brief breakfast, and Hayes seemed more agitated than usual, constantly checking his watch and the GPS unit. "Change of plans," Hayes announced as we finished eating. "We're abandoning the southeastern route." New orders came through during the night. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Our communications equipment had been acting up for days, and I'd seen no evidence of any incoming transmissions, but no one called him on it. "Where are we headed?" Martinez asked. Hayes consulted his map. though I suspected he already knew exactly where we were going. Northwest, back toward the main research corridor, we'll establish monitoring stations along a modified route. Northwest would take us away from the fissure and whatever lay beneath it, away from the warm air and distant voices and impossible green glow. Part of me felt relieved. Mountaineering had taught me when to retreat from dangerous situations, but another part, the part that had driven me to climb the world's most dangerous peaks, rebelled against walking away from the greatest mystery I'd ever encountered. We packed up camp efficiently, but I noticed that Jackson and Thompson were moving more slowly than usual, finding excuses to linger near the edge of the fissure. They'd heard the voices too, or seen the lights, or simply sensed that we were on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. As we loaded the vehicles, Thompson approached me. He was a quiet man in his 40s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his career handling gear in extreme conditions. "You've been listening," he said quietly. "Down there. What did you hear?" I glanced around to make sure Hayes wasn't in earshot. People. Living people. Down in that crack. Thompson nodded grimly. "Jackson thinks so too. We've been talking about it." "Talking about what?" "About what happens if we just drive away and pretend we'd never found this place." He looked toward the fissure, where the warm air was still rising in visible columns in the cold morning air. How do we live with ourselves knowing we found something like this and just left? It was a question I'd been asking myself all night, but before I could answer, Hayes was shouting for everyone to mount up. We drove northwest for 3 hours, putting the fissure behind us, but the landscape remained wrong. Too many hills, too many valleys, ice formations that shouldn't exist according to any map. It was as if we'd crossed into a different version of Antarctica, one where the normal rules of geography no longer applied. During our midday stop, Hayes spread out his map and began marking locations for the monitoring stations. But I could see that his hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes kept drifting back toward the southeast, where we'd left the fissure behind. "First station here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map that looked identical to every other spot. "We'll establish base camp and begin installation tomorrow." But Jackson wasn't looking at the map. He was staring back the way we'd come, where a thin column of warm air was still visible on the horizon like a distant smoke signal. "We need to go back," he said suddenly. Hayes looked up sharply. "What?" "That fissure. Whatever's down there, as we can't just ignore it. This could be the discovery of the century." "Our job is weather stations," Hayes replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Jackson. "Our job is supposed to be weather stations," Thompson added quietly, "but we all know this mission was never about weather stations." The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes stared at the two men, and I could see him weighing his options. He had authority, but authority only worked when people were willing to follow, and it was becoming clear that his team was having second thoughts about abandoning the greatest mystery any of us had ever encountered. "The mission parameters are non-negotiable," Hayes said finally. "Then maybe it's time to renegotiate," Jackson replied. That evening, as Hayes set up our camp in another anonymous stretch of ice, Thompson approached me again. This time Martinez was with him. "We're going back," Thompson said without preamble. "Tonight. You're the mountain expert. We need your help." "Hayes won't authorize it," I pointed out. "Hayes doesn't need to know," Martinez said. "We slip out after he's asleep, rappel down into that fissure, and see what's really down there. A few hours, that's all. By morning, we're back here and no one's the wiser." It was insane. Rappelling into an unknown crack in the ice, in the middle of Antarctic night, without proper backup or communication with base camp. Every rule of safe expedition practice said to walk away, but I thought about those distant voices and the impossible warmth rising from the depths. I thought about 15 years of climbing mountains because they were there, of pushing into places where humans weren't meant to go. "What about equipment?" I asked. Thompson smiled grimly. "Already taken care of. Ropes, harnesses, lights, emergency supplies, everything we need for a basic reconnaissance. If Hayes finds out..." "Let us worry about Hayes," Martinez said. "Are you in?" I looked back toward the southeast, where that column of warm air was still faintly visible against the starless sky. In all my years of extreme exploration, I'd never walked away from a mystery this big, and if I did walk away now, I knew I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what we'd left behind in that crack in the ice. "I'm in," I said. 3 hours later, while Hayes and Volkov slept in their tents, 3 figures slipped away from camp and began the long trek back toward the fissure. We moved quietly across the ice, guided by GPS and the distant column of warm air that marked our destination like a beacon. By the time we reached the edge of the crack, it was nearly midnight, though in Antarctica's endless twilight, time was becoming meaningless. The fissure yawned before us, black and mysterious, with that impossible warm breeze still rising from its depths. I set up the anchor points while Thompson and Martinez prepared the ropes. My hands shook slightly as I tested the hardware, not from cold, but from the magnitude of what we were about to do. We were about to descend into a place that shouldn't exist to meet people who shouldn't be there. "Last chance to change your minds," I said as I clipped into my harness. Neither of them hesitated. "Let's go see what's down there," Thompson said. And with that, we stepped over the edge and began our descent into the impossible. The descent took longer than expected. What had looked like a simple crack from the surface revealed itself to be a complex system of interconnected fissures and chambers. The walls were smooth ice for the first 30 metres, but as we rappelled deeper, the ice gave way to exposed rock. Dark stone that looked nothing like the typical Antarctic geology I was familiar with. The warm air grew stronger as we descended, carrying with it scents that shouldn't exist in this frozen wasteland. I caught hints of vegetation, wood smoke, and something else. Something organic and alive that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "How far down do you think this goes?" Martinez whispered, her voice echoing strangely off the walls. "GPS shows we're about 60 metres below surface level," I replied, checking my instruments. "But the acoustic properties suggest the chamber system extends much deeper." Thompson, rappelling on the rope beside me, suddenly stopped. "Light," he said. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. Far below us, barely visible in the darkness, was a faint greenish glow. Not reflected light from our headlamps, but something generating its own illumination. "Bioluminescence," Martinez suggested. "Maybe," I said, but I'd never heard of bioluminescent organisms surviving in Antarctica's extreme conditions. We continued our descent, moving carefully through a series of natural rock formations that created a rough staircase down through the fissure system. The walls here showed signs of modification, not recent construction, but ancient stonework that had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. "These aren't natural formations," Thompson observed, running his hand along a section of wall where the rock had been deliberately shaped. "Someone carved these passages." The stonework was crude but effective, creating handholds and ledges that made the descent easier. Whoever had carved them understood the principles of safe passage through vertical terrain. But the style was unlike anything I'd seen in my travels, neither modern nor matching any historical human civilization I was familiar with. As we descended deeper, we began to encounter artifacts. The first was a stone marker, roughly the size of a gravestone, placed on a natural ledge about 90 metres down. The surface was covered with carved symbols that looked like a mixture of pictographs and abstract geometric patterns. The carving was fresh, recent enough that the edges were still sharp and clean. "Can you read any of this?" I asked Martinez, who had some background in archaeology. She studied the symbols carefully, running her fingers over the carved lines. "It's not like any writing system I've encountered. But see this symbol here?" She pointed to a recurring mark that looked like a stylized mountain peak. "It appears multiple times. Could be a warning, or maybe a territorial marker." We photographed the stone thoroughly before continuing down. The next artifacts appeared about 20 metres deeper. Tools fashioned from bone and metal, cached in natural shelters carved into the rock walls. The bone was worked smooth and polished, while the metal pieces showed signs of sophisticated forging techniques. "The metalwork is impressive," Thompson noted, examining a knife blade that gleamed despite what must have been years of exposure to the elements. "This isn't primitive technology." But it was the footprints that truly shook us. We found them preserved in a patch of softer sediment that had accumulated on a wider ledge, about 120 metres down. At first glance they looked almost human, bipedal, with what appeared to be 5 toes. but the proportions were wrong. Too long, too wide, with claw marks that suggested the owners walked on the balls of their feet, rather than flat-footed like humans. "How big would you estimate the creature that made these?" Martinez asked, kneeling beside the clearest print. I placed my boot next to the largest track for comparison. The print was nearly half again as large as my size 11 hiking boot, and significantly wider. "Big," I said, "and recent. These couldn't have been here more than a few days." The implications were staggering. We were looking at evidence of large, intelligent bipedal creatures living in a hidden ecosystem beneath Antarctica's ice sheet. Creatures that made tools, carved stone markers, and established settlements in places humans had never explored. As we continued deeper, following the warm air currents that grew stronger with every metre of descent, we began to hear sounds from below. Not the distant voices I'd detected from the surface, but closer, more immediate sounds. The creak of ropes or leather, the scrape of tools against stone, and underneath it all a low harmonic humming that seemed to come from multiple sources. "They know we're here," Thompson whispered. He was right. The sounds had a quality of alertness, of activity stirred by our presence. Whatever lived in these depths was aware of our descent and was responding to it. At 150 metres down, we reached a wider chamber where multiple fissures converged. The green glow was stronger here, emanating from phosphorescent moss, or lichen, that covered much of the rock surfaces. The air was noticeably warmer, perhaps 50 degrees Fahrenheit, an impossible temperature for this latitude and depth. But it was what we saw across the chamber that made us all freeze in place. 3 more stone markers, much larger than the first, arranged in a deliberate triangle around what appeared to be a sleeping area. Furs and woven materials were spread on the ground, with the remnants of a recent fire still glowing faintly in a circle of carefully arranged stones. Tools and implements hung from carved hooks on the walls, and dried meat or fish was suspended from the ceiling in neat rows. Someone lived here, not visited occasionally, but actually made this impossible place their home. "My God," Martinez breathed, "it's a dwelling!" As we examined the living space more closely, I became aware of another sound. Not the random noise we'd been hearing, but something more organised. Musical, almost, with a rhythmic pattern that suggested communication. Horn calls echoing up from deeper in the fissure system. Long, haunting notes that seemed to carry messages between unseen listeners in the darkness below. "They're signalling," I realised, warning each other that we're here. The horn calls continued for several minutes, creating a complex pattern of long and short notes that felt like a conversation between distant speakers. Then, gradually, they faded into silence. But the silence was worse than the noise. It had the quality of held breath, of predators waiting in the darkness for prey to make a wrong move. "We should go back," Martinez whispered. Part of me agreed. We'd found evidence of a hidden civilization, documented proof of intelligent life in one of Earth's most remote places. That was enough for any expedition. But another part of me, the part that had driven me to attempt impossible climbs in the world's deadliest mountains, wanted to continue. We were on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. How could we turn back now? "A little further," I said, "just to see what's below this chamber." Thompson nodded agreement, but Martinez looked uncertain. 15 more minutes, I promised. "If we don't find anything significant, we turn around." It was a promise I would come to regret, because what we found in those next 15 minutes would change everything and ensure that none of us would ever be the same again. The passage beyond the inhabited chamber led through a series of natural archways carved from the living rock. The phosphorescent moss grew thicker here, providing enough light for us to see without our headlamps. The air continued to warm as we descended, and I could hear the sound of running water somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Underground river," Thompson observed. "That would explain the ecosystem down here. Geothermal activity providing heat, fresh water, maybe even mineral deposits that support plant life." But the scientific explanations felt inadequate as we rounded a bend in the passage and saw what lay ahead. The fissure system opened into a vast underground valley, so large that our lights couldn't reach the far walls. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above us, supported by natural columns of stone that had been carved and decorated with the same symbolic patterns we'd seen on the markers. But it was the floor of the valley that took our breath away. It was covered in a carpet of the moss and low-growing plants, creating a miniature ecosystem that glowed with soft bioluminescent light. A river wound through the centre of the valley, its banks lined with what looked like cultivated gardens, and scattered throughout this impossible landscape were structures, not crude shelters, but sophisticated dwellings that showed evidence of advanced construction techniques. "This is incredible," Martinez whispered. "How is any of this possible?" "The temperature down here must be nearly 70 degrees. "Geothermal vents," I said, pointing to columns of steam rising from various points around the valley. "The whole area must sit on top of an active volcanic system. That would provide heat, fresh water from melted ice, and mineral-rich soil for agriculture." But even as I offered the scientific explanation, I knew we were looking at something far more complex than a simple geothermal oasis. The level of organisation, the sophisticated architecture, the evidence of a stable civilization, this wasn't just a survival community. This was a thriving society that had existed hidden beneath the ice for God knows how long. We made our way down into the valley, moving carefully through the cultivated areas. The plants were species I didn't recognise, adapted for low-light conditions but obviously providing food and materials for the inhabitants. Some looked like root vegetables, others resembled grains or fruits. All of them showed signs of careful cultivation and selective breeding. The dwellings were even more impressive up close. Built from carved stone and what appeared to be some kind of organic mortar, they were circular structures with conical roofs that reminded me of traditional African or Celtic architecture. Each was decorated with intricate carvings that seemed to tell stories, hunting scenes, astronomical observations, and recurring images of the ice world above. "Look at this," Thompson called softly from near one of the larger structures. "These carvings show the surface. They know what's up there." The relief carvings depicted the ice sheets, the distant mountains, and even what looked like modern vehicles or aircraft. Whoever lived here wasn't isolated from the outside world. They were actively observing it. As we moved deeper into the settlement, I began to notice signs of recent activity everywhere. Fire pits with warm ashes, tools left casually on work surfaces, food preparation areas that showed evidence of recent use. The inhabitants hadn't fled at our approach. They had simply withdrawn. "Where is everyone?" Martinez whispered. It was a good question. The settlement clearly housed dozens, maybe hundreds of people, but we hadn't seen a single living soul since beginning our descent. The horn calls we'd heard earlier had gone silent, replaced by an oppressive quiet that felt like the hush before a storm. We were examining a particularly elaborate dwelling near the centre of the settlement when Thompson grabbed my arm. "Movement!" he hissed. "On the ridge!" I looked where he was pointing and felt my blood run cold. A figure stood silhouetted against the phosphorescent glow on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. Tall and imposing, wrapped in what appeared to be furs or heavy cloth, with a face painted or masked in white that seemed to glow in the strange light. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't making any sound. It was simply watching us. "How long has it been there?" Martinez whispered. "I don't know," Thompson replied. "It could have been watching us since we entered the valley." As we stared up at the silent watcher, more figures began to appear on the surrounding ridges. They emerged from concealment like ghosts, materializing from shadows and rocky overhangs until we were surrounded by dozens of motionless observers. All tall, all wrapped in furs, all with those unsettling white faces that seemed to float in the darkness. "Nobody move," I said quietly. "No sudden movements, no aggressive gestures." But even as I spoke, I was calculating distances and escape routes. We were in the bottom of a valley with limited exits, surrounded by unknown numbers of potentially hostile inhabitants. Our ropes were 200 metres above us, assuming we could even reach the chamber where we'd started our descent. For several minutes we stood frozen in a bizarre standoff. The watchers made no move to approach, but they also showed no signs of leaving. They simply observed us with an intensity that felt almost physical, as if they were studying every detail of our appearance and behaviour. Then, without any visible signal, one of the figures on the central ridge raised its arm and pointed, not at us, but back toward the passage we'd used to enter the valley. The gesture was unmistakable. "Leave." "I think they want us to go," Martinez said unnecessarily. "The question is what happens if we don't," Thompson replied. As if in response to his words, more figures appeared on the ridges. Not just dozens now, but what looked like hundreds, emerging from concealment in the rocks and behind the settlement structures. They still made no threatening moves, but the message was clear. We were vastly outnumbered, and our welcome had expired. "We should respect their wishes," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to stay and try to make contact. This was the discovery of the century, proof of a hidden civilization that had survived in one of Earth's most hostile environments. Walking away now felt like abandoning the greatest opportunity in human history. But I'd spent 15 years in situations where good judgment meant the difference between life and death, and my judgment was telling me that we were moments away from a confrontation we couldn't win. "Back to the passage," I said, slowly, no threatening moves. We began to retreat, moving carefully through the settlement with hundreds of silent watchers tracking our every step. The figures on the ridges remained motionless, but I could sense movement in our peripheral vision. More inhabitants emerging from the structures around us, following our progress through their hidden world. As we reached the passage that led back to the upper chambers, I risked one look back at the settlement. What I saw made my skin crawl. The valley floor was now filled with figures. They had emerged from every dwelling, every shadow, every concealed position, until the entire settlement was alive with silent observers. Men, women, children, an entire civilization that had been watching us from the moment we entered their domain. And in their absolute silence, in their complete stillness, there was something far more menacing than any overt threat could have been. "Move," I said urgently, and we began our hasty retreat toward the surface. But as we climbed back through the carved passages, I couldn't shake the feeling that our visit had changed something fundamental. We had been witnessed, catalogued, assessed, and somewhere in those silent, watching faces, decisions were being made that would have consequences far beyond our ability to imagine. The inhabitants of the hidden valley now knew that the surface world had found them. The question was what they intended to do about it. The climb back to the inhabited chamber felt endless. Our headlamps cut through darkness that seemed thicker than before, and every shadow looked like it might conceal a pursuing figure. The silence was oppressive, no sound except our own breathing and the scrape of our boots against stone. "Are they following us?" Martinez whispered during a brief rest on one of the carved ledges. I listened carefully, straining to hear any evidence of pursuit. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint whisper of air currents through the fissure system. Then I caught it. A soft sound, like leather against stone, coming from somewhere below us in the darkness. "Yes," I said. "Keep moving." We climbed faster, abandoning stealth for speed. But the sounds of pursuit grew closer, not the heavy footfalls you'd expect from people climbing after us, but something more subtle. Whispered communications in a language that sounded like wind through rock formations. The scrape of tools or weapons against stone, and underneath it all, a rhythmic sound that took me several minutes to identify. Drums. They were using drums to coordinate their movements, passing signals through the fissure system with low, resonant beats that our presence almost masked. "They're not just following us," Thompson realized. "They're organizing." Getting ahead of us. He was right. The drum signals were coming from multiple directions now, including passages that branched off from our route. Whatever pursuit force was tracking us, they knew these tunnels far better than we did, and they were using that knowledge to surround us. We reached the inhabited chamber where we'd found the dwelling, but it was no longer empty. Fresh torches burned in wall sconces that hadn't been lit during our descent, and the sleeping furs had been disturbed. Someone had been here recently, possibly was still here, hidden in the shadows beyond our headlamp beams. "Don't stop," I urged. "Keep climbing." But as we prepared to continue up toward the surface, Martinez suddenly grabbed my arm. "Listen," she whispered. The drum signals had stopped. The whispered communications had ceased. Even the sound of movement through the passages below us had fallen silent. The only thing we could hear was the sound of our own breathing, unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "They're waiting for something," Thompson said. Before anyone could respond, the torches in the chamber began to go out one by one, plunging us back into the darkness of our headlamps. But in that brief moment before the last torch died, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, multiple figures positioned around the chamber watching our every move. "Go," I said. Now. We scrambled up the carved passages as fast as we dared, using our headlamps to navigate the increasingly treacherous terrain. Behind us, I could hear the sound of movement resuming, not hurried but purposeful. Our pursuers weren't panicking or rushing to catch us. They were herding us, driving us towards some predetermined destination. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't escaping. We were being guided. The inhabitants of the valley had let us discover their settlement, had allowed us to retreat, and were now directing our route back to the surface. But why? As we climbed higher, approaching the point where we'd cached our rappelling equipment, I began to understand. The warm air currents that had drawn us into the fissure system were still flowing, but they'd changed direction. Instead of rising from the depths, they now seemed to be flowing horizontally, as if being artificially directed through the passage system. They're manipulating the airflow, I realised, herding us like sheep. The implications were terrifying. If the inhabitants could control air currents throughout the fissure system, they possessed technology far more sophisticated than their primitive-appearing tools and dwellings suggested. We weren't dealing with a simple, isolated community. We were confronting a civilization with capabilities we didn't understand. We reached our rappelling station to find that our equipment had been disturbed. The ropes were still anchored, but they'd been examined, tested, and carefully rearranged. Someone had been here while we were exploring the valley, studying our gear with the same intensity we'd brought to examining their tools and dwellings. They know exactly what we're capable of, Thompson said grimly. They've been watching us since we started the descent. As we prepared to rappel back to the surface, the sounds of pursuit resumed below us. But now they were different, more urgent, more coordinated. The whispered communications became a constant stream, and I could hear the sound of multiple groups moving through the passages beneath us. They're converging on this position, Martinez observed. I clipped into my harness and started up the rope, but something felt wrong. The anchor points we'd set were solid, tested to support much more weight than our group represented. But as I climbed, I could feel vibrations in the rope that suggested movement above us. Someone's up there, I called down to the others. The surface, which had represented safety and escape, might now be as dangerous as the depths we were fleeing. We were trapped between unknown pursuers below and equally unknown threats above. But we had no choice. Staying in the fissure system meant certain confrontation with inhabitants who outnumbered us by hundreds to one. At least on the surface, we had our vehicles and the possibility of escape. I reached the top of the fissure and immediately knew something was wrong. Our tracks in the snow had been obliterated, not by wind, but by careful brushwork that left the surface looking untouched. Someone had been covering our trail, eliminating evidence of our presence. As Thompson and Martinez joined me on the surface, we discovered that the fissure itself had changed. Where we'd left a crack about 3 feet wide, we now found a gap barely 18 inches across. The edges showed signs of recent ice formation, as if someone had been working to seal the opening. "They're trying to close it," Martinez whispered, "hiding the entrance." But even as she spoke, we could see that the sealing work was incomplete. The fissure was narrower but still passable, and the warm air still flowed up from the depths. Whatever forces were at work below, they weren't finished with the surface world yet. As we gathered our gear and prepared to make our way back to base camp, I caught sight of movement on the horizon. Dark shapes against the white ice, too regular to be natural formations. They were moving in our direction but too distant to make out details. "Company," Thompson said, following my gaze. We had perhaps an hour's head start before whatever was tracking us across the ice would reach our position. An hour to get back to camp, convince Hayes that we'd discovered something extraordinary, and decide what to do with the most dangerous secret any of us had ever encountered. But as we began the long trek back across the ice fields, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. The inhabitants of the hidden valley had been watching the surface world far longer than we'd been watching them. And now that contact had been made, there was no going back to the way things were before. The ice beneath Antarctica held secrets that humanity wasn't ready to face. But ready or not, those secrets were about to emerge into the light. The journey back to camp took on the quality of a nightmare. What should have been a 3-hour hike across relatively flat terrain became a desperate flight through an ice field that seemed to shift and change with every step. The dark shapes we'd spotted on the horizon were gaining ground. moving with a speed and coordination that defied explanation. Through my binoculars, I could make out individual figures, tall, fur-wrapped forms that moved across the ice with an efficiency that made our struggling progress look clumsy and amateur. "They're not using snowshoes or skis," Thompson observed during one of our brief rest stops. "How are they moving so fast?" I focused my binoculars on the nearest group of pursuers and felt my stomach clench. They weren't sinking into the snow because they weren't walking on the surface. They were using some kind of broad, flat footwear that distributed their weight so efficiently they could practically run across terrain that forced us to trudge. "Indigenous snow travel technology," I said. "Probably been perfected over centuries." But even as I offered the explanation, I knew it was inadequate. The speed and coordination of our pursuers suggested capabilities that went far beyond advanced snowshoes. They were moving like a military unit, with scouts ranging ahead and flankers maintaining precise formations. Martinez checked her GPS and swore. "We're still 4 kilometres from camp. At this rate, they'll catch us before we're halfway there." I did the math in my head and came to the same grim conclusion. Our pursuers were covering ground at nearly twice our speed, and they showed no signs of fatigue. Unless something changed dramatically, we'd be overtaken long before we could reach the safety of Hayes' camp. That's when Thompson disappeared. One moment he was trudging through the snow beside us, the next he was simply gone. No cry, no sound of struggle, no disturbance in the snow to mark where he'd been. I turned around to find Martinez and myself alone on the ice field with no sign of our missing teammate. "Thompson!" Martinez called, but her voice was immediately swallowed by the wind. I dropped to my knees and examined the snow where he'd been walking. There were his boot prints, clear and deep, leading in a straight line toward our destination. Then nothing. The print simply stopped, as if he'd been lifted straight up into the air. "This isn't possible," Martinez whispered. But I was already scanning the surrounding terrain for any explanation. Crevasse? No, the snow showed no signs of collapse. Sinkhole? Not in this type of ice formation. The only logical conclusion was that something had taken Thompson. Silently, efficiently, and without leaving any trace. "We have to keep moving," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to search for our missing friend. "We can't just leave him." "If we stop to look, we'll all disappear," I replied, gesturing toward the horizon, where our pursuers were still gaining ground. "Whatever got Thompson is probably what's been tracking us. Our only chance is to reach camp." We resumed our desperate trek, but now every step felt like it might be our last. The ice field around us looked empty, pristine, untouched by human presence. But I knew that was an illusion. Something was out there, moving through the snow with predatory patience, waiting for the right moment to strike. The attacks, when they came, were almost anticlimactic. Martinez simply stumbled, caught herself, and looked back at me with an expression of confused surprise. "I can't... my legs," she began, then collapsed face first into the snow. I rushed to her side and found her unconscious but breathing. There were no visible injuries, no signs of violence. She'd simply stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch in her brain. As I knelt beside her, trying to determine what had happened, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Whistling. Not the wind, but a human sound, coming from somewhere nearby in the apparently empty ice field. I looked up to find myself surrounded. They had emerged from the snow itself, rising like ghosts from concealed positions that I would have sworn were empty moments before. Tall figures wrapped in white furs that perfectly matched the surrounding terrain, with faces painted or masked in patterns that made them nearly invisible against the ice and shadow. The closest figure was perhaps 10 feet away, standing motionless with what appeared to be a carved bone implement in one hand. Others were positioned in a rough circle around me, equally still, equally silent. They had been hunting us with the patience of apex predators, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. I raised my hands slowly, making no sudden movements. In my years of extreme environment travel, I'd encountered isolated communities before. Most were suspicious of outsiders, but could be reasoned with if you showed proper respect. But these weren't curious locals wondering about strangers in their territory. These were soldiers, disciplined and organised, who had been tracking us with military precision. And the implement in the nearest figure's hand wasn't a tool, it was a weapon. The whistling sound came again, and I realised it was a form of communication, The figures around me were coordinating their movements with the same kind of tactical precision I'd seen in special forces operations. "We mean no harm," I said, though I doubted they understood English. "We're leaving. Going back to our camp." The nearest figure tilted its head slightly, studying me with an intensity that was almost physical. Then it raised the bone implement and pointed, not at me, but toward Martinez's unconscious form. The message was clear. She was coming with them. "No," I said, moving to stand protectively over Martinez. "She stays with me." The figure's response was swift and decisive. It made a sharp gesture, and something struck me in the neck. Not painful, but startling. I reached up to find a small dart made from carved bone and what felt like organic fibres. The world began to blur at the edges. My vision narrowed, and my legs felt like they were made of water. The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was the figures lifting Martinez and carrying her away across the ice, moving with the same impossible speed that had allowed them to track us across the frozen wasteland. When I woke, I was alone. The sun had moved significantly across the sky, suggesting I'd been unconscious for several hours. The snow around me showed signs of activity, many footprints, drag marks, and the aftermath of what must have been a significant operation. But Martinez was gone, along with any trace of our pursuers. I checked my GPS and found that I was less than a kilometre from Hayes's camp, close enough that I could make it on foot, assuming whatever had taken my companions didn't return for me. As I struggled to my feet, still groggy from whatever they'd used to drug me, I found something that made my heart sink. A piece of torn fabric from Thompson's jacket, partially buried in the snow, and beneath it, carved into the hard-packed ice, was one of the symbols we'd seen on the stone markers in the hidden valley. They weren't just taking prisoners. They were leaving messages, marking their territory, making it clear that the surface world was now part of their domain. I stumbled toward camp through the gathering darkness, driven by the desperate hope that Hayes would believe my story and help me mount a rescue mission. But deep down, I knew it was already too late. Thompson and Martinez were gone, taken by inhabitants of a world that wasn't supposed to exist. And somewhere beneath the ice, decisions were being made that would affect far more than just our small expedition team. The hidden valley had been discovered, its secrets exposed, and its guardians were about to make sure that exposure came with a price the surface world wasn't prepared to pay. I reached Hayes's camp just as the last light was fading from the Antarctic sky. My stumbling approach through the ice fields must have looked like the arrival of a madman, clothes torn, face windburned, babbling about hidden civilizations and missing team members. Hayes took one look at me and immediately began barking orders. Medical check, emergency protocols, communications with base. Within an hour, I was wrapped in thermal blankets inside the command tent, sipping hot coffee while Hayes and Volkov interrogated me about what had happened. Underground valley, Hayes repeated for the third time, with inhabitants. Hundreds of them, I insisted, to maybe thousands. They have dwellings, agriculture, sophisticated technology, and they took Thompson and Martinez. Volkov exchanged a look with Hayes that I didn't like. Altitude sickness can cause hallucinations, he said carefully, combined with hypothermia, exhaustion. I'm not hallucinating, I snapped. Check the GPS logs. Look at the photographs Martinez took. There's evidence. But when we checked Martinez's camera, the memory card was missing. My GPS unit showed our route to the fissure and back, but the waypoints I'd marked for significant discoveries had been erased. Even the torn piece of Thompson's jacket that I'd brought back as proof had somehow disappeared from my pack. "Where are Thompson and Martinez?" Hayes asked. "I told you. They were taken by the inhabitants of the valley." "What inhabitants?" "You're the only person who's seen these alleged people." The interrogation continued for hours, but it was clear that Hayes had already made up his mind. As far as he was concerned, I'd suffered some kind of breakdown during a solo reconnaissance mission, and Thompson and Martinez had died in a crevice fall or equipment failure. "The official report will list them as lost during scientific operations," Hayes said finally. "Weather-related accident. You'll be evacuated to McMurdo for medical evaluation and debriefing." "You have to send a search team back to that fissure," I pleaded. "They might still be alive." "There will be no further operations in that area," Hayes replied with finality. "Mission orders are clear." I was flown back to McMurdo Base the next morning, sedated against my protests. The debriefing there was even more intensive, with psychologists and medical personnel who seemed more interested in my mental state than in the extraordinary discovery I was trying to report. Within a week, I was on a transport plane back to Christchurch, officially diagnosed with severe stress reaction and altitude-induced psychosis. My contract with Meridian Logistics was terminated, my security clearance revoked, and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement placed before me with a clear understanding that signing it was the only alternative to permanent institutionalization. I signed, but signing the papers didn't erase what I'd seen, and it didn't bring Thompson and Martinez back. For months afterward, I tried to find someone who would listen, someone who would investigate. I contacted researchers, journalists, government officials. The response was always the same: polite skepticism followed by suggestions that I seek continued psychiatric care. The official record shows that Thompson and Martinez died in a crevasse accident during routine scientific operations. Their bodies were never recovered, which isn't unusual in Antarctic conditions. The weather station mission was completed by replacement personnel, and Meridian Logistics moved on to other contracts. I tried to move on too. Got a job guiding mountain climbing expeditions in the Rockies, far from anything that reminded me of ice and snow. Tried to convince myself that maybe the psychologists were right, that the stress and isolation had caused me to imagine things that couldn't possibly exist. Then the package arrived. It was waiting on my doorstep one evening 6 months after my return from Antarctica, wrapped in what looked like sealskin and tied with sinew. No return address, no postmark, no indication of how it had gotten there. Inside was a carved stone marker, identical to the ones we'd found in the hidden valley. These symbols were sharp and fresh, as if carved yesterday, and they included new pictographs that hadn't been on the original markers. Images that clearly depicted our expedition, our descent into the fissure, and our encounter with the valley's inhabitants. But it was the final symbol that made my hands shake as I traced its outline. It was a perfect representation of my house, complete with details that could only have been drawn by someone who had seen it firsthand. The message was unmistakable. We know where you are. We know where you live. We remember. I moved the next week, leaving no forwarding address. Changed my name, my appearance, my entire life. But I know it doesn't matter. The inhabitants of the hidden valley found me once, and they can find me again whenever they choose. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howls through whatever temporary home I'm occupying, I hear sounds that remind me of that underground realm. The whisper of leather against stone, the distant echo of horn calls, the rhythmic beating of drums coordinating movements in the darkness, and I know that somewhere beneath the ice of Antarctica, in valleys that don't appear on any map, decisions are still being made about how to deal with the surface world that stumbled onto their ancient secrets. Thompson and Martinez are still down there, assuming they're still alive. Maybe prisoners, maybe something worse, and the inhabitants of that hidden realm are still watching, still waiting, still planning. The Antarctic Treaty declares the continent a place of peace and scientific cooperation, protected from military activity and territorial claims. The treaties only work when all parties agree to their terms, and there are inhabitants of Antarctica who were never consulted, never invited to participate in humanity's grand plans for their frozen continent. Whatever is beyond the wall doesn't want us there, but it knows where we live, and someday I fear it's going to come calling.